Alright guys, what is up? It's the Tominator back with another installment in the Best Body Parts series. We're almost there, just got 2 more muscle groups to go, and today we're talking about the hamstrings. Now I'll be honest with you, this one felt like a slog to get through. If other areas like biceps or quads had too many great examples to choose from, the hamstrings had too few. I was sort of grasping at straws and guesstimating in order to fill the bottom couple positions, because exceptional hamstring development isn't often immediately obvious. This is a body part that is almost entirely dependent on conditioning, at least in the back poses, and that is going to vary from show to show, so it makes it very difficult to narrow down the list. Even guys who are in tip-top shape rarely show anything mind-blowing in terms of hamstring detail, so this is typically a very underwhelming muscle. It's sort of like the unsung hero of modern bodybuilding in the sense that it's almost impossible to win a contest nowadays without a solid pair of hamstrings, but at the same time, they really don't tend to garner a whole lot of praise or attention. It also doesn't help that virtually none of the old school guys were even in the running. Hamstrings and glutes were barely accounted for back in the 60s and 70s, and even by the 1980s, it was more of a nice to have rather than a need to have. Case in point, Lee Haney won 8 Sandows in a row with weak hamstrings. Aside from definition though, the other aspect you gotta consider is the hamstring sweep, or in other words, that hanging look when seen from the side. This depends less on conditioning and more on mass and muscle fullness, and when properly developed, this is one of the few times the hamstrings do tend to catch your eye. So that's pretty much what we're looking for here. Detail and definition in the back shots, combined with good sweep in the side chest and tri. It's pretty simple, this ain't exactly rocket science here, guys. And on that note, let me introduce my pick for number 10, Nick Walker. Yeah, I know, he's the flavor of the week, or I guess the year you might say, and many people would have probably put him much higher. But I'll explain why that's not the case in a sec. On the positive side, for a young bodybuilder, Nick has already built up some extraordinarily massive hamstrings. You can note that thick cord of muscle running down his leg there when he flexes, and the sweep from the side is pretty good too. That said, there's a couple of reasons why he barely squeaked on here. First is that he's still very green, with barely any pro contests under his belt, so there just wasn't a lot of material to draw on. Secondly, as good as his conditioning has been thus far, he could still show more detail. And third, yeah, his thickness from the side is awesome, but the hamstrings could use a little more roundness. These next 2 entries will help put these shortcomings into perspective a bit more. With that said, it's perhaps a little generous including him at all at this point, but I feel like Walker can only improve going forward, as the sheer amount of muscle he's packing back there gives him immense potential and deserves some recognition. Okay, our first honorable mention goes to Nasser El Somebody. Nasser's a bit of an odd duck, because his glutes were almost always soft, but when he was in shape, the hamstrings looked amazing. You can see rows of fibrous ribbons running up and down his thighs here, and based on images like this, you could definitely argue he warrants a spot. But Nasser's conditioning from the back was extremely hit or miss, and when he wasn't on, all that detail disappeared. Same goes for Rolly Winkler, who personally was the toughest cut for me. When Rolly's on his A-game, his hamstrings are among the best in the modern ranks, no doubt. The issue with Rolly is that he's often off his game, and without that crisp conditioning, his thighs get washed out from the rear. Okay, so moving on to number 9, we've got Kevin Levrone. Like I said, I'm not totally sold on these bottom selections, but the reason I went with Levrone was because back in his heyday, especially early on, like here in '94, the guy had some incredible hamstring definition. I once heard it described in a magazine article as something along the lines of more grooves than a vinyl record, and what an apt description. Even Dorian can't quite match this back in 1992, and Yates was no slouch himself in this department. Kevin also had some very nice fullness from the side, which helped complete his masterful side chest. Sean Ray in the middle there was pretty good himself in this area and could be considered an honorable mention. Next up at number 8 is Dennis Wolff. Wolff made the list almost purely for his jaw-dropping, hanging effect. From the rear, they were nothing particularly special. One could even argue they were somewhat lacking in density and detail, but his lower body was absolutely devastating in these side shots. The big bad Wolff had some of the most voluminous hamstrings you'll ever see. It was like massive slabs of beef just hanging off of him. So as with the quads, he might seem like a bit of an odd choice that kind of bucks the rules we laid out in the beginning. In both cases, whether we're talking quads or hammies, he doesn't exactly excel in terms of detail or separation, but his sweep and shape are simply so remarkable that alone propels him into my top 10. Your mileage may vary, but that's the way I see it. Coming in at number 7 is the Pac-Man Ben Pakulski. One of the more cerebral bodybuilders to ever ascend to the professional ranks, Ben was known for his superb leg development. And even though consistency and longevity were not his fortes, he was always going to be on my radar for this one. And I think at his peak, few could argue he doesn't belong here. Just look at how ripped those hamstrings were in these back shots. Though it's difficult to measure the mass of the hams in isolation, there's no denying he's whooping Dexter Jackson size-wise here, and probably even outconditioning him too. From the side, they were good but not great, and that, plus his lack of consistency, is why Pakulski doesn't land any higher. And speaking of Dexter Jackson, the recently retired Hall of Famer represents yet another honorable mention. His hamstrings were invariably lean and dry, and when we're talking about a body part that is so dependent on conditioning, that alone almost secured him a spot. I think where Dexter really shone brightest was in the glute ham tie-in, or that area right below the glutes where the hamstrings sort of insert right beneath. This was always crisp and tight as a virgin, excuse the crude simile, but I can't recall ever seeing loose skin or wrinkles on Dexter in this region, unlike so many of his fellow competitors. So, in other words, the upper hamstrings are what made it for the blade. The issue with Dex is simply a lack of mass and wow factor. His hamstrings looked kinda thin down by the knee, and his sweep and detail, while very good, were not quite outstanding enough to crack the top 10. Next up, Branch Warren checks in at number 6. Like his fellow leg monster Ben Pakulski, and another obvious name we'll see soon enough, Branch was on my radar from day one. Like the rest of his physique, his hamstrings brought that same characteristic graininess we've come to associate with him. Just look at this photo, it's like steel cables running along underneath his skin. When it comes to hard, conditioned lower body mass, almost nobody can top Branch Warren. I still think his side shots could have been better in terms of sweep though. This is really good, but not as insane looking as some of his back poses in my opinion, so that's a big reason why Branch finds himself in the middle of the pack and not towards the top. But speaking of hard, dense muscle, what about Dorian Yates, you might ask? The original poster boy for graininess, Yates represents another honorable mention. His hamstrings were exceptional, I'm not denying that, but let's face it, they were a complete afterthought compared to his monumental back and calves. When you think of Dorian Yates, hamstrings are probably among the last body parts that come to mind, and that is telling. So no, I don't think he warrants a spot here. Top 20 definitely, but not top 10 in my eyes. So at number 5 is my dark horse pick, Tom Prince, the unofficial king of the hanging hamstring. I remember stumbling across this pick years ago while making another video and just being like, what the fuck is that? I know it's backstage and therefore not as meaningful as an actual contest photo, but still man, this is some crazy stuff. Almost looks photoshopped. Here's another shot confirming that the sweep was real. And when flexing from the rear, you can see this guy definitely didn't skip leg day. But like Wolff, Prince mainly made the cut because of his insane hamstring sweep from the side, not so much his detail, since I couldn't find many pics showcasing that. They really stood out in the side chest though, and that's a rare thing indeed to have the hamstrings draw so much attention in a mandatory pose like this. To put it in perspective, just plunk him in a lineup and see how far ahead he really was. It's not even close. Okay, at number 4 we've got another Tom, a much more famous one, and of course it's gotta be Tom Platz. And trust me, he's only this low because the names ahead of him were just that damn good. As an old-school bodybuilder, Platz was naturally fighting an uphill battle here. Like we established in the intro, hamstrings were typically neglected and treated as non-essential back in those days. Gym equipment was also far more limited. Not that you need a vast array of machines to hit the hamstrings adequately, but it certainly doesn't hurt that the pros today have access to way more options for targeting this muscle group. But anyway, correct me if I'm wrong here, but Platz may have pioneered the infamous moon pose, which was swiftly banned from competition. Not sure if the judges considered it too sexual or homoerotic or something, but whatever the case, I haven't seen anyone do it on stage in my lifetime. It was, however, an incredibly effective method for showcasing hamstring definition. You can practically count the individual muscle fibers here. Platz also displayed what has got to be, hands down, the best hamstring drop of his era. I challenge you to find another bodybuilder pre-1990s that can hang with this, pun intended. We could certainly debate about him being bumped up a spot or two, and I wouldn't have much objection to that, especially if we adjust for the time period. But wait until the end of the video and tell me who ought to be knocked down. Alright, so you probably have a pretty good idea by now, just by simple process of omission, who's going to be rounding out the top 3. But before we get to that, let's just quickly rattle off a couple more honorable mentions. Coincidentally, these guys are all either in 212 or classic physique and narrowly missed out. Take Breon Ansley, for example. The former classic Mr. O is seriously underrated these days, not just in general, but in terms of the hamstring specifically. He had some crazy ripped definition that almost looked like sutures at times, like someone had surgically made an incision, then stitched it back up. That's how diced he was here. But, of course, being in classic with the weight caps, he was often relatively flat and lacked sweep from the side, hence why he was excluded. These 212 guys are the exact opposite. John Jewett, Noel Adame, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, and Ahmed Ashkanani all have some of the nuttiest hamstring sweep I've ever seen, but from the back they often lack those deep cuts. In Noel's case, he's also a newer name if I'm remembering correctly. I don't believe he's been around long enough to establish much of a contest history, so there's no way I could justify him being on here just yet. But all 3 of these guys are some underrated gems in the hamstrings department, and I feel they deserve a special mention. Now, no doubt there are many other candidates that I'm forgetting or simply unaware of, but it doesn't really matter at this point since none of them could possibly compare to what's coming next. Okay, and with that out of the way, let's carry on to the big 3. Kai Greene comes in 3rd place. Now, trust me, I hate his social media antics as much as the next person, but you cannot discount the physique this guy built back in his prime. It's no exaggeration to say that Kai had some of the largest, densest hamstrings of all time. There's very few bodybuilders that could stand toe-to-toe with Kai and come out ahead, especially as far as the lower body's concerned. Even when he didn't totally nail his conditioning, he somehow always seemed to manage to show good detail in the hamstrings. But when he was peeled, oh boy, watch out, the man could not be stopped. In my estimation, the Predator had the best combination of size, fullness, and raw definition we've seen yet, which is why he beats all the other names mentioned thus far. I was even flirting with the idea of putting him in the top 2, but ultimately decided against that, because these next 2 entries were just too dominant to be denied their rightful place at the top of the totem pole. And herein lies what I expect to be the most controversial moment of the whole video, because Ronny Coleman lands at number 2. That's right, the king is not the GOAT when it comes to the hamstrings in my opinion. But it's damn close, like winning by a hair, split decision type of close. This could honestly go either way, but for me, the greatest hamstrings of all time belong to one Phil Heath. He's the rightful number 1, and that's that. Case closed. End of video. Okay, that's not that. Allow me to elaborate. Now, we might as well discuss them together since the verdict is out. First, let's focus on Coleman. If there's 2 muscle groups that Ronny really dominated in, other than his back and biceps, it's gotta be the glutes and hams. The guy was a freaking alien from the back, and it's largely because of how massive and shredded his lower body was. In his best pictures, it's tough to argue against Ronny in number 1. I feel like only a blind hater could do that. But again, it's not so much that I'm arguing against Ronny as that I'm arguing for Phil. These guys are more like 1A and 1B as opposed to 1 and 2. Look at how he utterly trounces Jay Cutler in 2003. To be fair, it looks like Jay might have relaxed for a second, but it would have been a blowout regardless. It's like Ronny took the same humongous mass and definition that Kai had, and then cranked it up a notch. This amount of staggeringly shredded muscle mass should be humanly impossible, but somehow the king pulled it off time and time again. My only niggling complaint is that from the side, he didn't display the greatest sweep. Compared to guys like Prince or Wolff, this isn't as impressive, and that's the main reason why Ronny fell to second. Phil Heath, on the other hand, presented better in the side chest. That's simply undeniable. Ronny's legs might have been bigger overall, but most of it was quads, whereas Phil exhibited a better balance between the quads and hams. His conditioning and definition was also right on par with Ronny's, as you can see in these pics right here. I'm not even sure how he could physically pack more detail into this area. It's unbelievable, like a friggin' human anatomy chart. Phil's one of those guys that just had that ideal complexion and paper-thin skin to really maximize muscle definition, and that's partly what helped him win those 7 Sandows. Here's a crystal clear 1v1 with Kai where I'd give the edge to Phil. I'm sure you can find the odd photo where Kai's hamstrings look better, but again, based on this look, and just generally speaking, I'd say Phil's legs were a little more proportionate, whereas Kai was more quad-heavy like Ronny. And here we've got another comparison with 3 other previously mentioned names, and again, I'd put Phil on top when it comes to the hams. But if nothing else, the deciding factor has got to be found in their presentation. Look, we all know that Ronny wasn't the greatest poser. In fact, he often succeeded in spite of his posing, not because of it, and he sometimes didn't take the time to point out or highlight his best features as much as he probably should have. Contrast that with Phil, who often made a deliberate effort to show off his strengths, like his triceps back at the 2010 Arnold Classic, or here with his hamstrings at the 2017 Olympia. Nobody else in the lineup could reach this level of razor-sharp separation, and he knew it. So he wisely made a point of playing that up, and now, like the inverse image of Jay's iconic quad stomp, his legacy has been forever cemented in the annals of bodybuilding history. Alright, that's going to wrap things up for this one. Thank you for watching, guys, and I hope you enjoyed it. Would you more or less agree with these selections, or is there someone else that you feel should have been featured? This proved to be one of the harder lists to compile because hamstrings are typically such an overlooked body part, it made it tough to pin down. But in any case, give me your feedback in the comments below, and next time around we'll finally be finishing off with the top 10 calves. Until then, this is the Tominator signing out, and I'll be back.